Got a couple more filtering in. I'll give them a second to sit down. But it's good to see everybody this morning. If I haven't gotten a chance to meet you, I've been running around like a chicken with my head cut off. But if I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, I'm Hayden. My wife Maggie is here with me, and we're very excited to be here. I'm coming down here from Rogers, Arkansas. And I'm excited to be here with you this week, excited to be studying with you this week. This morning, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be studying Jonah. So as I talk, if you want to turn there, go ahead and head that way. But yes, I just graduated in May from Florida College with a biblical studies degree. My wife is working in a school right now, but she wants to do nutrition. Yes, I've got it on. So we're very, very excited to be here, very excited to be with you all. We're excited to get to know some of you guys, all of you guys, hopefully. Last 2 years. The last 3 years. All right, we got one. Yeah, so, okay, a couple more, yeah. So Jonah isn't a book that we look at a lot. And that's because Jonah is it's a small book, right? It's a small book, and it's a story that we learn a lot when we're kids. It's a story that we learn a lot in vacation Bible schools or in children's classes, and we kind of don't really touch it as much when we get older. But Jonah is one of my favorite books. I think it's one of the most instructive books in the Minor Prophets because it's really a straightforward story that we can understand. It's a straightforward story that is easy for us to latch on to and to grasp. A lot of times in the Minor Prophets, you see some difficult things. You see prophecies. You see apocalyptic literature. You see a lot of difficult things that you don't really know how to read very well unless you dig deep into them. But Jonah, you can read it and it just slaps you in the face and you know what's going on. So I'm excited to talk with you this morning about Jonah, and this class on Jonah is going to connect to our classes, our sermons throughout the rest of this week. We're going to be discussing life in Babylon, the Christian's life in a sinful world. And we're really going to see Jonah and how he interacts with, quote-unquote, Babylon. He literally interacts with Nineveh, but he interacts with a sinful world in some specific ways that we can learn from. So, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to jump right into Jonah chapter 1. Jonah chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, and it said, 'Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me.'" Now, what do we know Jonah does right after this? God has made this call. What does Jonah do? Runs away. He just books it. He tries to get as far away as possible. And you may know this, you may not, but one of the interesting things about where Jonah decides to go, it says in verse 3, he decides to sail for Tarshish. Tarshish is literally as far to the opposite side of the world as Jonah could have possibly gone. They didn't really have the entire world mapped out, but Tarshish was pretty much the exact opposite side of the planet compared to Nineveh. Jonah was seeking to get as far away as possible. He was trying to do what he could to get away from this command that God had given him. And there's some interesting reasons for this. We're not given an express reason here in the text. All it says is that Jonah ran away. But we do know a few things about Jonah. One of the things that we know about him is that he is a court prophet. Jonah was mentioned in another place in 2 Kings chapter 14 and verse 27. You don't need to turn there, but in 2 Kings chapter 14 and verse 27, if I can find it here, it reads, I'm in chapter 24. It tells us a little bit more about Jonah that we don't really learn from the book of Jonah. In verse 27 of chapter 14, it reads, "And since the Lord had not said that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, he saved them from the hand by the hand of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash." And it's talking about a prophecy that Jonah had given there up in verse 25. It says that the king Jeroboam II was the one who restored the boundaries of Israel from Lebo-Hamath to the Dead Sea in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath-Hepher. And we see in Jonah chapter 1 and verse 1, Jonah is again introduced as Jonah, son of Amittai. We know this is the same guy. And it seems reasonable to understand that Jonah was a court prophet. That means he worked for the king, he worked for the government, pretty much. Jonah was a government employee, and he worked for the king. He prophesied for the king, and he prophesied things that would expand the borders of Israel. He prophesied things that would make Israel prosperous. At the time that Jonah was written, Assyria was very downtrodden. They were at a weak point. They were not very strong, and Israel was in a very strong place. They were in a very, I guess the word we would use is, they were almost like a superpower at the time. They were almost like a superpower at the time. Israel was on the up and up, and Nineveh was on the down and down. And so God tells Jonah, this man who worked for the government, who would have had a strong sense of patriotism, he tells him to go and prophesy, to preach to Nineveh. And Jonah runs away. Now, this is kind of weird because he says, God tells Jonah that he wants him to go and preach against Nineveh. And later on we see that God tells Jonah that he wants to preach the destruction of Nineveh. And so typically Jonah, a man who works for the government, would be excited to see one of their enemies destroyed, right? I mean, if we saw that North Korea was about to get blown up by Ukraine or by Russia or whoever, we probably would not shed a tear. But Jonah, instead of going and prophesying what God had told him to do, he runs away. And we see what happens when he runs away. Let's pick up again in verse 4. It says, "Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship." One thing that's really interesting about this passage is there in verse 4. There in verse 4, it says that the storm was so violent that the ship threatened to break up. If you go back into the Hebrew and you read what this meant, it's really interesting because there's a little bit of an anthropomorphization of this ship. In the Hebrew, it's read more accurately as the ship itself thought it was going to break apart. That should tell you just how violent this storm is. The ship itself thought it was going to break apart. That's pretty crazy, pretty wild storm. There is not anyone here, I don't think, that would not be terrified, would not be scared for their life. All of these sailors, it says, were afraid. They were crying out to their own gods. They were throwing cargo. They were trying to do everything that they knew, everything that they could to survive. What does it say Jonah's doing in the last half of verse 5? He's sleeping. He is sleeping. You think Jonah was really sleeping? Or do you think he was trying to ignore what he knew he had brought? It's possible either way. But Jonah was sleeping. He obviously, either way, did not care about what was going on. In verse 6, it says, the captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." And then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And so they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all of this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" These sailors, they are terrified, they are scared for their lives, and Jonah is sleeping. And he wakes up, and Jonah probably knew exactly what was going on. You run away from God, and then a giant storm comes onto your ship that is so violent that it threatens to tear your entire ship in half. You probably have a pretty good idea as a prophet of God that you might have messed up. You might have done something wrong. Jonah had no issue discovering who was at fault here. And we know that because he tells them that it's him later on. Picking up in verse 9, after these sailors have asked Jonah a bunch of questions, he says, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Is there anything interesting about Jonah's answer that you notice here? What does he not do? Go back and look at verse 8. What does he not do? Yeah, he doesn't say what his occupation is. He doesn't really answer much of the questions that they present to him at all. He brings about this entirely different answer. They didn't ask him what God he served. He does answer, and he tells them that he's a Hebrew. He's from the nation of Israel, but They didn't ask about what God he served. They didn't ask about any of that. They asked what he did. They asked why he was there. And they asked where he came from. And so he doesn't really answer their questions straight up. He gives them an interesting, a strange answer. But in verse 10, we see that they have an interesting response to this. These are pagans. Keep that in mind. It says, this terrified them. And they asked, what have you done? Because they knew he was running away from the Lord. He had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, what should we do to make the sea calm down for us? He said, pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. And then they cried out to the Lord, please, Lord, don't let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased. Then they took Jonah, they threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. And at this the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice and made vows to him. What stands out to you in this group of verses here? What are some interesting things that happen here?
Well, when they cried out to the Lord, they cried out to Yahweh.
Yeah, absolutely. These pagan sailors, they cried out to God. They didn't cry out to their gods like they had done earlier. They cried out to Yahweh. That's an interesting point, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because my version back in verse 9, it says, I am Hebrew and I fear the Lord. And now they actually fear the Lord because they're realizing that he's the one who's doing this.
Yep.
Where Jonah has been ignoring the storm and forgetting that God should be feared.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the critical parts of this first chapter. We see here Jonah, a man who worked for God, who was supposed to be the mouthpiece of God, who was supposed to be a holy prophet for God, doesn't fear God like a bunch of pagans fear God. These men came to fear God more than a man of God, a prophet of God, did in this chapter. That should tell us something about what's going on here. Yeah.
For sacrificing innocent people. Here, they didn't want to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that's a lesson for us, because a lot of times we think of all those people out there as less than us, as not having the same morals or understanding, yet these, they have more consideration for Jonah than we have.
Yeah, and what we're going to see later as the book progresses is that these pagan sailors weren't willing to sacrifice. These pagan sailors who would have been used to human sacrifice were not willing to sacrifice Jonah. But later on, in chapter 4, Jonah is willing to sacrifice the entire city of Nineveh, to let the entire city of Nineveh die so that Israel could be stronger, so that Israel wouldn't have to worry about another enemy, so that he wouldn't have to worry about another enemy, so the people he disliked would be done away with. That's what he was willing to do. Yeah.
The sailors prayed, but it doesn't say anything about Jonah praying.
Yes.
Why wasn't Jonah praying?
Yes.
He wanted to say
Yes. And yeah, Jonah does not even pray here. And that makes it a little curious that he automatically knows what to do. Right? He doesn't pray to God, and yet he tells the sailors exactly what to do. He says, throw me into the sea. Throw me into the sea. Seems like Jonah is running away from the problem. That's an easy way out for him. He would rather die than go to Nineveh. Scott?
It just made me think, as you're saying that he's willing to go through some struggles to get his way.
Yeah.
It's his reasoning that he doesn't want to go to Nineveh. And so he's willing to, I'll suffer some
Yeah.
What we do see, he's going to pray, and when he does, it's at that point of, oh wow, I've gone too far. You know, and God's sending him a very powerful lesson at that point. But that's just something how we can actually make that decision. I think I'm willing
Yeah.
to put up with some of the suffering because I'm still getting what I want.
Right.
You know, or whatever. That's just an interesting choice.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible doesn't say here, I mean, they were pagans, they worshiped other gods, they would call them other gods, but it doesn't say that they were human sacrificers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so to say that, hey, they're used to human sacrifice, I think that's maybe a little too, you know, on, you know, or too forward, because these seem like they had some type of conscience, they didn't want to take a life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and stuff, but I mean, they did worship other gods, but not necessarily, they were necessarily, not everybody that worshiped other gods were offering human sacrifices.
Right, and yeah, that's just, and it's possible that they wouldn't have been, and the geography is just what dictates, of this area, just dictates what we think they might have been used to, and it's possible that they aren't. That's a good point, yeah. Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing, if you're a student in history, is Nineveh, these were the sworn enemies of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And when they took a country, I mean, they were very vicious.
Yes.
So you can understand how Jonah felt, because these are sworn enemies. And my interesting thing about Jonah is he repents, so to speak, when he's in the belly of this fish. But then when he landed there and did what God told him to do, what did he do? He's back to the other side. I knew you would do this.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I wanted the city destroyed. He didn't say that in so many words, but that's what he did.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that we as Christians a lot of times will feel sorry for something we did, and we do the same thing as Jonah. We pray about it, and then we go and do it again.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Jonah did. I mean, he was very human. But if you study what Nineveh and the country was like, this is their capital, we would understand why Jonah's attitude was this.
Yes, yeah, and the city of Nineveh was absolutely wicked. Jonah had every right to dislike Nineveh. I mean, these are people, and this is a bit graphic, but these people, they would put their enemies on the walls, literally. They would skin their enemies and put that on their city walls. I mean, these were a vicious and brutal people. They were evil, wicked people. And so it's understandable that Jonah felt the way about them that he did. That doesn't excuse what he does, how he disobeys God, but we can understand just how much disdain for the Ninevites Jonah would have had. And we're going to talk about this a little more later, expand on it more later. But the disdain that Jonah has is a disdain that sometimes we can fall into having for the world around us. We look at the world around us as an enemy nation, when in reality we should be looking at them more as wounded people who need salvation. Mm-hmm.
That's brutal. I think it's interesting that the reason that they attribute God to doing this power is because it works.
Mhm.
They throw him into the water.
Yeah.
He's swallowed up. They obviously can't find him or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so they become converted. And
Yeah.
they do these vows. And it's kind of, I don't know if it's humorous to me or what, but it's interesting to think, what were they vowing? Oh, just God is real. You know, I'm
Yeah.
going to do better.
Yeah.
We don't know what that means, but we're going to, you're the God. And it's interesting to see this conversion
Mm-hmm.
of them. And God must have understood that this power would help them.
Yeah.
And that's why Jonah is going there.
Yeah. And what's curious about that is Jonah doesn't even preach to them. These people saw the power of God firsthand. They did not need a sermon. They didn't need a Bible class. They saw the power of God and they converted. They turned to God. And I think that's a powerful demonstration of just how impactful God himself is in people's lives. His word is impactful. Sermons, Bible classes, they can convert a lot of people, but it's really not us that's working. God, we're just the ones that plant the seed. God is one that provides the increase, right? And in this situation, God absolutely supplied the increase here. Those are a lot of great comments. We're going to have to move on into chapter 2. And this is where we're going to see the prayer that we mentioned just a few minutes ago. We're going to see this prayer that Jonah gives. And I want you to pay close attention to what Jonah does and doesn't say in this prayer. Starting in verse 17, the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And from the inside of the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord God. He said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very hearts of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down, and the earth barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord." And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. So a couple things I want to mention before we have some more discussion here. One thing that we notice is Jonah gets into the belly of the fish, and he finally starts praying. He didn't pray during the storm. He didn't pray when he was thrown off. It's not until he gets into the belly of the fish that Jonah prays here. A couple other interesting things that are mentioned here. Jonah says that he is deep in the realm of the dead. Later on, it also says that God brought him up from the pit. There's an interesting word choice there. Is Jonah alive or dead in the belly of the fish? Is this poetic literature? Is he being literal here about death? Has God brought Jonah back from the dead, or has he just had him alive in this fish? I can't give an answer for that. I can't give a perfect answer, but it's something to consider. That even if Jonah is alive this whole time, that he was so close to the brink of death, and yet God still brought him out of it, that demonstrates the power that God has. This man was on the brink of death. This man was in the belly of a giant fish. An uncomfortable experience. It probably smelled pretty bad in there. That alone would be awful. But imagine how claustrophobic it would be in there. Even if Jonah wasn't dead, it would feel like he was dead. He would probably wish he was dead. And God has brought him out of it. One interesting thing to note in verse 6 is that language, that pit word there, is Sheol. And that's the Jewish place of the dead. And like I said, we aren't sure if this is him talking about being in literal Sheol or if he's talking about it metaphorically. This is done other places in Scripture. But it is something to think about, something to chew on there. So you should consider that and do some thinking about that. But as we get into a few of the other verses here, what is something interesting that Jonah either does or does not say? Mm-hmm.
I think to me the interesting thing is I, when you go down through it, he's very self-centered.
Mm-hmm.
See that later also, that it's all about him.
Yep.
It's not I need to go and help these people. It's
Mm-hmm.
I.
Yeah, and what does he do there in verse 8 and 9? He says, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. Who actually turned away from God's love for them? Jonah. And who turned to God? Those who previously clung to worthless idols. This is a reversal here. Jonah is saying, oh, I'm still better than these pagans, even though I've run away from you, God. He's putting himself up on a pedestal. He's saying, I'm better than these guys, even though those guys on the ship, they made sacrifices, they made vows to God, they turned to God, and Jonah, a prophet of God, didn't. He says, I with shouts of grateful praise will sacrifice to you. Who made sacrifices to God in Jonah? Jonah might have done it after the book was over, maybe. But in the book of Jonah, who made sacrifices to God? The sailors. He's sitting here and he says, what I have vowed, I will make good. Who made vows to God? The sailors. Jonah is all about me in this prayer. What else? What does Jonah not say ever in this prayer? Something that would be pretty important, I would think.
Lord, forgive me.
Yes. He never says sorry. He never asks for forgiveness. He just assumes that God is going to bring him out of this. He does not ask for forgiveness. He does not apologize in this prayer. And maybe he made another prayer that's not recorded. Maybe we don't have every single thing that Jonah ever thought. Maybe he had another prayer. But in this prayer that we're given, Jonah does not repent. Jonah does not ask for forgiveness. And we talked a few seconds ago about how Jonah kind of placed himself on a pedestal. Jonah still hasn't recognized what he has done is wrong. He's just looking for a change in circumstance. Jonah wants to get out of this belly of the fish. He wants to get out of this difficult situation. He wanted to get thrown overboard earlier so that he could die and get out of having to go to Nineveh. He wants to get out of this fish so that he doesn't have to deal with it anymore. And he says, okay, God, I'll do what you want. He's not saying, God, I am so sorry. I have made a mistake. He's not contrite. He says, I am going to do all of this. I am going to do all of this, so let me have the fish now. He just wants a change in circumstance. Jonah has a very interesting character. He's a guy that's supposed to be more righteous than these pagans, supposed to be more righteous than these Ninevites. And over again, we see Jonah making the same mistakes and doing wicked things. Running from God, having a huge amount of ego and pride, and wishing for the deaths of people made in God's image. That is terrible stuff. And I think what, up to this point, we've seen from Jonah, what we can learn from Jonah, is that we as Christians are not perfect people. Jonah was a prophet of God. God literally spoke to Jonah, and he was still making these mistakes. My prayer is that Jonah realized what he was doing and came back to God. But Jonah, in this passage, in this book, doesn't quite get it. And in our lives, there are times when we just don't quite get it. Jonah should be our wake-up call, that we need to have a sense of humility. We are not greater, we are not better than any man, woman, or child. We can make mistakes, we can turn away from God, we can fall away from the faith, but Jonah should be our encouragement to come back. We don't want to be like that. We don't want to be prideful. We don't want to have these huge egos that could fill a room. We want to be humble servants of God that want to bring his word wherever we go. Jonah's a great lesson, a great example of what not to do in that way. Scott, you had something?
Oh, yeah, along that line, you were telling me.
Oh.
This is Rodney Green. But not along that line. Along that line, the idea of him saying, I am a Hebrew,
Mm-hmm.
and we fear God.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of like saying, we are God's people,
Mhm.
you're not.
Yeah.
And the idea of that sense of, God will never say anything bad about me,
Right.
and I'm not really going to be in the wrong here, especially when I compare myself to the world, to all the bad things. And that's the thing we see ringing out over and over in the New Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
That, when Jesus was speaking, he would find faith in those that were the outsiders.
Right.
And struggle to find faith in those that should be his people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what you're saying, and that's what I think we can see in Jonah is that sitting on your status as now I'm one of God's people. It's great that we got there,
Mm-hmm.
and God welcomes us in, and we're part of his family. But that doesn't finish who we are. And
Yeah.
what you're saying is so true, that we can real easily fall on, well, I've done this for a lot of years,
Mm-hmm.
and that makes me, special to God.
Right.
No, our heart has to be in the right spot, and we can find the right heart in sinners.
Mm-hmm.
And when they hear the truth, they
Yeah.
respond. We should be responding the same way a sinner can do.
Yeah. Reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. You have this one guy who says, God, he says, Father, I've been here working faithfully for you for years and years. And my brother, he runs away. He lives his life with booze, with women, with all sorts of other things. And he comes back and you give him a feast? There's this idea in the Bible over and over again of God searching for the one that has run away from the 99. And we should have that same mentality. We should want to be a part of the 99. We should want to not run away from God, but we should recognize that as part of the 99, we're not any better than the one. God seeks those who are lost, even if they're people that we think are lesser than us, even if they're people that we think are worse than us. God called murderers, God called prostitutes, God called wicked, wicked people to be his children. And we should respect those made in God's image. We should respect people that seek after him as well. So, any more comments before we move on into chapter 3? Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting, verse 10, where God speaks to the fish. I don't think that I can remember anywhere in the scriptures where God spoke to an animal.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's another curious reference to animals later on. We won't really have time to touch on it, but at the very end in verse 11, it says that Nineveh has over 120,000 people in it. Should I not be concerned for them? And then he also says, and many animals. There's a weird emphasis on animals here, and from what I've read, we don't really know why. But it is curious, and I think one thing it does demonstrate is that God is God over all. He is over all things, not just humans, not just the spiritual realm. God is God over all things. Earthquakes, God's in charge of them. Giant fish, God's in charge of them. Cows and sheep, God is in charge of them. I think it demonstrates the totality of his power over all things. It's very striking to me, and I think it's a great piece of encouragement to recognize that we serve the King of all kings, the King over all things. Anybody else? Mm-hmm. Dave.
I find it interesting that, and I think it relates to us today,
Mm-hmm.
is that you can rebel against God, still claim that you fear him.
Yeah.
And this guy here did that very thing.
Yeah.
And so that makes you wonder, it begs the question, how much do you fear him?
Yeah.
Because he did admit that God, who God was and all that.
Mm-hmm.
He said he feared him, not probably obviously repented, but it's just a contradiction for Christians to say, I fear the Lord, and then do things opposite of his will. And
Yeah.
I find it astounding that happens.
Yeah.
It's something that we could take away from this. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah. Jonah is a prophet of God, and even he was not immune to falling to sin. And so we need to be thinking in our heads, is that me? Have I grown to lessen my fear of God? We need to always focus on having a respect, on having a healthy fear of the Lord. Even if we feel as though we've been Christians for 20, 30 years, we've been Christians for 40, 50 years, you're not immune. You need to make sure that you are focused on recognizing who God is. You need to make sure that you have that constant respect, that constant fear for him. So we're going to have to move on into chapter 3 real quick. We see, I'm going to skip around a little bit, but we see again in verse 2, God says, go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message that I give to you. And then skipping down into verse 4, well, let's mention one thing about verse 3. It says, Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to get through it. Then in verse 4 it says, Jonah began a day's journey into the city, proclaiming 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. So we see one interesting thing here. Jonah, it says, goes 1 day into the city when it says that Nineveh should have taken 3 days to cover. It says that Jonah goes 1 day into the city. And then he proclaims 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. He doesn't proclaim any kind of redemption. He doesn't proclaim any kind of salvation. He doesn't say that there's any hope. You almost get the picture that Jonah goes 1 day into the city, finds the most dead, empty street corner, and whispers, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. He goes a day into a city that should have taken 3 days to cover, and he says, he could have said it more times, but it says he proclaims it one time here. But what happens after that? They repent. It says in verse 5, the Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. And it says that this warning came to the king of Nineveh. It says that he put on sackcloth. He sat down in ashes. This was a sign of mourning. He was mourning the sins of Nineveh. And he says, by the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Don't let them eat or drink. But let everyone be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone urgently call on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. So we see here a contrast between what the king says and what Jonah says. The king recognizes what he has done wrong, recognizes what his people have done wrong. He says, let us give up our evil ways, let us give up our violence. Jonah never recognizes what he's done wrong. Another thing that the king mentions is, who knows, perhaps God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. Jonah almost assumes that God is just going to rescue him, is going to save him. And that's why he tries to make this deal with God. But the king of Nineveh, he doesn't assume salvation. He doesn't assume that God is going to save them. Instead, he says, who knows, maybe God will relent. What this tells me is that the Ninevites, they're not doing this because they know salvation is coming. They're doing this because they know they were wrong. This salvation is not guaranteed to them. All they were told was they were going to be destroyed. This salvation is not guaranteed to them, and yet they still wanted to make a change. That should be important for us to notice. That these people, they weren't promised anything great, anything happy. They weren't promised a positive ending. And yet they still wanted to turn and serve God. They still wanted to turn away from their wickedness. I think that should tell us something about how we should behave. We shouldn't behave as though salvation is guaranteed for us. We should behave as people who are sinful, who are undeserving of salvation, who should want to change, even if we don't get anything out of it. But that's the positive thing that we'll talk about a little later this week. We do get something positive out of it. We do have a promise of heaven, a promise of something better than these Ninevites have. Mm-hmm.
The one thing I have on this book is Jonah himself. He did not have a change of heart because we see him sitting on a hill and we don't know what his response was to the plant dying and the lesson God was trying to teach him.
Mm-hmm.
He's a figure there that we don't know what happened to him.
Yeah.
Did he repent? Did he ask God forgiveness? We don't know those things.
Right.
So to me, that means we have to be very careful of our attitude, not only to other people, but our own attitude to them.
Mm-hmm.
Because here he is, we don't know what happened to him.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll see that in chapter 4. After this city was saved, after God relented in verse 10 of chapter 3, Jonah, it says to Jonah it seemed very wrong and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord?" He said, "When I was still at home, this is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love. You are a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, O God, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." I love what God says here. He says, is it right for you to be angry? Is it right for you to be angry? Jonah is angry that God saved the lives of 120,000 plus people. Jonah is angry that 120,000 plus people turned to God. Jonah is angry that 120,000 plus people turned away from wickedness and sin and turned to God. We can't afford to be like that, brothers and sisters. We cannot afford to be like that. One of the most important lessons that we learn from Jonah, we see this in a few verses later on. One of the most important things that we should learn from Jonah is that we need to have concern for the people of this world. We need to have love for the people of this world. We need to care for others by bringing them the gospel. It's good to care for others by bringing them food, by giving them a place to stay, by giving them warm clothes. But it's even better to care for them spiritually. We're going to talk about this later on this evening, but we need to seek to bring the citizens of this planet, of this earth, to God. And we need to rejoice when they come instead of being angry like Jonah is here. Jonah is a perfect example of how not to live in the world that we live in. He's a perfect example of what not to do. So hopefully, you've learned a few lessons from this book of Jonah. Hopefully, you've been able to take a few things away, and you've learned, like I've learned, that we need to do better than him. We need to do better. We need to be better servants of God, and we need to seek after people with more fervor and with more joy in our hearts than Jonah. Thank you guys for your attention. That'll bring us into our 15-minute break.